Thanks for having me. My name is Chris, and I'm an alcoholic. Yeah, it's really great to be here. It's great to be in OLDYPAA. YPA played a big role in my sobriety. I got sober January 29th, 1990, class of 91. Never took a legal drink in my life and didn't do very many legal things when I was drinking anyway. I started drinking in 6th grade. I started by stealing alcohol from my dad, and I would hide it in my Lego village. They would always come searching my room, but never find it hidden away in the pristine Lego build. So I definitely started drinking young. From that moment on, I was always in trouble. My preference at that time was to get by was stealing, so I would steal things from people as well. I'd steal my parents' car, steal their money. And that was kind of how it went. I would occasionally get in a lot of trouble and kind of suspend operations for a little bit, but inevitably go back to drinking. By the time I got into high school, I graduated high school in 2 years because I dropped out the first two, basically, the middle two, and made it all back up. But I would ditch and I would go get fucked up with my friends, and that's what I would do. And steal things. It was very much the epitome of the unmanageable life. And it was everybody else's fault. My parents didn't do what I wanted them to do. They wouldn't buy me a car. The school didn't work the way I thought. I had a long list of grievances against society and everything else. And they were all made up whatever excuse I needed to do what I wanted to do. But as I would come to find out, the reality was I had no actual control over the drinking and drug use that I was doing. It had control of me. All of my supplementary criminal behavior gave me an interesting introduction to AA. What got the attention on my behavior in a much more significant way was I ripped off my grandmother by tricking her out of her house and then going in and emptying out her liquor cabinet. And that got me put into treatment. For those of us who got sober in the 80s and 90s, treatment was a common common part of the story from what I've learned to gather. And I was not at all interested in being in treatment. My plan was to get a hold of I'd stolen my dad's ATM card. And my plan was to get a hold of the PIN number, take a lot of money and run away and try to find a way to get a gun so I could rob people more directly. Which doesn't really match at all my life today in sobriety, but it's fascinating. I mean, that's what I was, those were my best plans that I had come up with. And so I got put into treatment, and the gist of treatment was that in order for me to get out of trouble, I had to not drink or do drugs. And that was a very challenging prospect for me at that time. I mean, that was always kind of the pattern I was in. I would get into trouble, and then I had to find a way to get out of the trouble and then go back to doing the things that got me into trouble in the first place. But this one I could not easily get out of. So every time I failed to stay sober in the treatment center, they would extend the duration of my participation and deepen the duration of my participation. So I had to go more days, more times. And as I found out later, they had plans to put me in, to take it all the way to putting me in like a 1-year inpatient thing. I was the first kid in the company my dad worked for. I was the first kid that a family of an employee had a drug and alcohol problem. So I was kind of this guinea pig. So apparently they had arranged for all this stuff, which I found out later. It's kind of amusing, I guess, now at the time, though. But I think that was the rub for me, trying to stay sober and failing to stay sober. Time and again, I could not do it. And I would make it a couple more days, maybe this time or that time, but something would always happen. We had to go on a family ski trip. I had convinced myself by the time we got on the bus for the ski trip that it was not possible to take a bus from Arizona to Colorado and not drink. Fascinating logic to behold today. But the very last time that I drank was I woke up that morning and I was on my way to school. After I got put into treatment, I had to go back to high school. And I was on my way to school and I was scared. Like, it was a feeling I'd never had before, but suddenly I was gripped with this idea that I had been wasted all weekend again. And, you know, the thoughts were racing through my head and alcoholic ruminations. And the things that I remember are things like, am I going to even get out of the car and go to school that day? Like, is it even going to stop? Nagging at me like why I wasn't able to make this happen. And the whole time my head is spinning like this, I'm trying to light a roach I don't know if they still call it that, like a stub of a joint. And I had a moment of clarity where I get very emotional, by the way, when I tell my story these days. I don't know why. It just started happening like 10 years ago. But I had this moment of clarity. And I realized just in a split second, if I threw that out the window, that I'd make it to school and I'd make it to treatment after, and that somehow everything would work out. And that was January 29th, 1990. So I went back to treatment, and I started going to meetings, and I got a sponsor, and they didn't believe me at first because I used to be the guy who said, how many meetings did you go to this week? On Monday, I would always have to report it, and I'd say, 0 or 1. My first AA meeting, I had to go with my dad. It sucked. He's not in the program. Thought that would have mattered, but I came back after this experience. I came back that next week, and they're like, how many meetings do you go to? And I was like, 7. And they're like, bullshit. You're such a liar. That was the reputation I had already earned in treatment. But I got a sponsor, and I started working the steps. As I recall, the quality of my headspace or thought life, if you will, at that time, it was a constant rumination. I could not stop thinking about drinking, but I was gripped with the fear that I would give into it and it would happen. So I called my sponsor a lot, and I went to a lot of meetings, and all the other things that I used to think about were just pushed out by this spin in my head. And, this guy walked me through the steps little by little. I was 17 years old at the time, so my resentments list was distinguished, but I've managed to add to it over the years for sure. I went, and I was able to make amends to my grandmother for lying to her and ripping her off, and to my parents and my sister. That changed that headspin. I've come to find out since, actually, that I have a better than average memory. And I remember a lot of details, but one thing I remember in particular was the first time I said no to alcohol. I had acquired a job at McDonald's, and I was driving one of my fellow McDonald's colleagues home, I guess, and he asked to stop somewhere, and he came back out and asked me if I had time for some free beer. There's only one thing I used to like more than beer, and that was free beer. And I told him no. And before I even could think about it, just in the same way, so many times I was drinking before I realized I was drinking and that I had blown staying sober once again. I told him no. And he looked at me the same way I was thinking about me, like, what did you just say? And I was like, dude, I got to go, man. And that was when the headspin started to subside, and I was no longer constantly thinking about drinking. I still also had to think a lot about lying, because I would lie as quickly as I would steal or drink. And that took a lot of step work and a lot of meditation. I recently heard one guy tell me from his story in my home group. He said his sponsor told him, you lie when it would be easier to tell the truth. And that was definitely me. One of the things I learned in AA is that I couldn't tell the difference between the true and the false. I didn't know. I couldn't comprehend it. I didn't understand the prison of self-will that I was in until that day when I stepped out of it and I told that guy no. And that was when my real recovery began. So fast forward, I got really involved in Arizona's OLDYPAA. We had a lot of early conferences back then, and it was an amazing experience for me, especially getting sober so young. But even now, I think it's always been really crucial for me to have sober friends, other people in sobriety. I'm easily influenced and even more easily convinced that I'm like other people when I'm not, and that's been crucial. OLDYPAA, ASCII-PA, young people's meetings, they've been something I've been involved in as often as possible and made a huge difference to me. I don't know quite how to describe it, but it's still a big world when you're young. And I needed examples of how to live in it, not just check the box. And I think service work in general, getting into YPA got me into district and area service, along, of course, with sponsorship and 12-step calls. And all of these things taught me how to live in the world and make mistakes and move on. Service work is a great place to make mistakes. When I first got into area, they had this big thing, the meeting schedules have to be free because our primary purpose is to carry the message. And then a year later, it was, no, we have to charge for the meeting schedules because we have to be self-supporting through our own contributions. Like all these great topics that we got to sort through, looking at the 12 traditions. There's no way I would be sober without that stuff. That stuff was and is my 12th step. And I didn't know how to have fun without drinking. I remember being in treatment after I'd been there for a little while. And I remember, somebody had been talking about something in some group thing. And I was trying to think about like the future. And in my mind, it just looked black. you can't get fucked up, everything's over. I had no sense of imagination at all for what that could even be. And young people stuff was fun. It was a mess. It was a bunch of sober alcoholics and all kinds of drama and all kinds of reality.